Good evening. Thank you all for being here, for joining us for this event. I am Dr. Esteban Ascona. I am a faculty member in the Southwest Center and for the Department of Mexican American Studies. And thank you all for coming tonight, which is the final part of the visit here to town and to campus of Dr. Rodríguez of UC Santa Cruz. Before talking a little bit about tonight and introducing Dr. Rodríguez to you all, I just want to thank the many entities that made this visit possible. Right? This thing only happens when a lot of people come together. And so I do want to extend my gratitude for the following co-sponsors of this event. This includes, so I want to thank Javier Duran, Alexandra Mora Medina, Iran Peña Bonilla, and the staff at the Cultural Center, Dr. Dan Martinez and the Binational Migration Institute, Dr. Wanda Alarcón and the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, Dr. Maribel Alvarez and the Southwest Folk Life Alliance, and of course my own units in Mexican American Studies, and the Southwest Center, particularly Jeff Bannister and Carlos Quintero Herrera. Furthermore, as part of this visit and the various other things that we've done, I want to thank the extraordinary musician and board member of the Tucson International Mariachi Conference, Adrian Perez, for his help in co-organizing the event that we had last night, as well as his board colleague, Jose Jimenez, for helping to promote tonight's event. Really appreciate the support that everyone has given to have Russell have a great visit here at Tucson. So I just want to share, in preface to what we're doing today is, a memory. And this memory goes back actually a little bit more than 25 years ago when, at the time I was a graduate student, I was directing the student mariachi there at the University of Texas, where I was a student in Mariachi Paredes de Tejastitlan, a student ensemble named in honor of the esteemed folklorist Don Americo Paredes. And as you do with the University Ensemble, what do? You go to mariachi conferences like the great one that we have here in town. And at that conference, I recall during a Q&A with Mariachi Vargas, who were the headlining group, and they were teaching some of the workshops. Someone in the audience, a woman came up to the microphone and she asked, "Tell us what you think about mariachi here in the United States." And the person who responded was the son of the then director, Jose Martinez. Signatures right here.
Yeah, I should try to stripe that, yeah.
So that's Jose Jr.
That's Junior.
Yeah. So Jose Jr., Pepe Jr. made the comment, and he said something to the effect of mariachi is treated as more important in the United States than in Mexico because of the efforts of Mexican Americans. And I remember sitting in the crowd going, "Wait, what?" I was surprised and I was a bit taken back or pleased, but I was surprised by the comment that he made, knowing how important this cultural symbol is. And throughout in response to that, there was a great applause by the audience, right? But I think they were surprised too. They weren't expecting that kind of embrace. And at the same time, they also knew it to be true, right? No one disagreed with Pepe's comment. And this is partly motivated because of the legitimization that it carried, a member of Mariachi Vargas, el mejor mariachi del mundo, saying how important mariachi was on this side of the border. Because these people knew that too. They had been working for decades in various ways in the community, in schools, and so forth, to establish this as a central part of what is happening with mariachi music north of the border. And there's a part of me that feels today, right, living here in Tucson, that while It wasn't in Tucson that Pepe Jr. said that, but I think in his own experiences of coming through Tucson for many years before, that he probably had Tucson partly in mind, right? The kind of meaning that exists about mariachi and the local culture that exists here, and the history that it is, and the many people who make that up. And I'm reminded of this as well last night of the event. We had a roundtable conversation with a number of members of the local mariachi community in conversation with Dr. Rodríguez about this very history, how animated people feel and how important it is, and the multiple layers that we were only able to scratch the surface with last night. And I want to thank those members of that conversation who are here tonight for attending. And so, as a part of my own work of wanting to shine a light on these histories and on these stories, this visit of Dr. Rodríguez and last night's conversation in particular is the launch of my own documentation project of Chicano Mexican American music culture, a project I'm entitling Mapping Chicano Music, as a way of collecting these stories, of archiving them and sharing them with the public, telling this musical life, the history of this musical life of Mexicans north of the border. And Tucson is an apt place to have this due to the deep musical history here in the community. And so it's important for me to sort of think about that, this place where I want to start this project. And as well, I think, apt as well that this longtime friend of mine, Russell Rodríguez, is a part of this very project. So let me introduce to you Dr. Russell Rodríguez. He has an extensive experience as a cultural worker, academic, and accomplished artist. He is currently an assistant professor in the music department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He received his Ph.D. in 2006 from the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And in 2007, he became University of California President's postdoctoral fellow, working under the direction of George Lipsitz. In 2023, Rodríguez was awarded the Americo Paredes Award by the American Folklore Society for his achievements as a practicing musician and scholar. Rodríguez worked as a curator for the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage in their annual festival, co-curating the Latino music program in 2004, and has contributed to a variety of productions by the Smithsonian Folkways Recordings as a researcher, producer, annotator, and musician. From 2011 through 2016, he worked as a program manager for the Alliance for California Traditional Arts, managing the apprenticeship program and contributing to scale programming that serve the California cultural communities practicing traditional arts. Rodríguez is an accomplished musician, composer, and dancer, specializing in performance styles of various traditional forms of Mexico. In 2010, he completed work as the assistant producer and musical director for the documentary La Danza Escénica, El Sello de Rafael Samarripa, and contributed original compositions to the Ray Paez's documentary, The Storm That Swept Mexico. In 2013, Rodríguez composed an original score for the theatrical interpretation of E. Travern's novel Macario, and in 2018, the score for the original theater play La Repartera, both for San Jose's premier Chicanx theater ensemble, Teatro. Having known Russell for a long time, I know that's also just scratching the surface of his accomplishments. But let me ask you all to welcome to the podium Dr. Russell Rodríguez.
That's very nice. Thank you. Thank you. I want to just echo the thanks for coming out, especially those that want to go see Duke lose. And I'm sure some of you have your phones plugged in. Just keep me updated. Before I start, I want to thank the mariachi musicians of Tucson. I have incredibly fond memories of that very first conference in 1983 and meeting people like Fred Tarazon, Ruben Moreno, who's here today, and and Trini Valencia, who are incredibly kind and incredible hosts to this ensemble that I was playing called Mariachi Mixlan, and I was actually the token Mexican in the ensemble. It was a compilation of symphonic musicians that were playing that were from Monterey. But it was a wonderful group, and people like Sharon Jones continues to be, part of this festival scene, both in Tucson and Albuquerque. And just to let you know, Gloria passed last year. Anyways, I have incredibly fond memories of Tucson and the Mariachi Festival that has changed my life. And I want to also, especially thank those that joined us yesterday, and Andreas here, and Adrian, and that had an incredibly vibrant discussion that was illuminating how people feel about this expression here in the beautiful city of Tucson. I want to recognize the wonderful Jarocho Collective here on campus and thank them for letting me play music with them yesterday. That was incredibly fun. And again, I want to echo my thanks to the Confluence Center by National Migration Institute, the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, the Southwest Folklife Alliance, and the Department of Mexican American Studies. And I specifically want to thank the crew at the Southwest Center, Jeff Bannister and Carlos Quintero Herrera, and a special, for very, very much taking care of me these past couple of days. And finally, a special abrazo to my dear colleague and Professor Esteban Ascona and Michelle Tellas for their gracious, untiring graciousness in hosting me during this wonderful stay. So, ay, canta y no compones. With the fickle state of music production in today's era, having transformed from recorded product industry to a process of listening and watching music through streaming platforms, comprehending the production and diffusion of music has been complicated and less evident. Reading the backside of notes on old LPs or liner notes from cassettes and CDs has become eliminated from the process of listening to music. Streaming also excludes the analytical perspective of a DJ who give us little cues of what's important in the recording. Integrated into this complexity, mariachi music has become equally convoluted in its comprehension as a cultural expression, as a popular music form, and as an artistic performance. Concurrently, the production of mariachi recordings that reach any type of public view or hearing have been whittled down to a handful of artists. Mariachi music produced on major labels such as Sony and Universal Music is represented by legacy artists. Pepe Aguilar, Alejandro Fernandez, the sons of Antonio Aguilar and Vicente Fernandez respectively, and more recently, the grandchildren of these two legendary singers. There are a few others, Luis Miguel, who vacillates between mariachi and Latin pop, and then there's Aida Cueva, La Madre de Mariachis, who serves as foundational model of ranchera singing style. Thus, the public imagination of mariachi music does not extend far beyond these artists. And Mariachi Vargas, of course, whose popularity is in recent time is tethered to the 20-minute segment that they played with Luis Miguel. While I believe these artists are committed to promoting canonical repertory of the mariachi, which is evident in their live performances, some of the more recent recordings by these artists and contemporary mariachis demonstrate a leaning towards songs that come from banda, sereno, norteño music, Mexican and US pop, as well as the hybrids of these forms. To be sure, this is not a new trend. Mariachi has always fused the plethora of song genres and styles into the performance repertory throughout its history. This leads me to ponder, however, questions about new songs being composed in the music style of mariachi. Who are the composers? Where are they being produced? How are they being distributed? But a more central question is, what is considered to be a mariachi song. Analyzing some of the compositional developments that mariachi music experience will be helpful in answering some of these questions. And in doing so, I will demonstrate the malleability of the mariachi through time and space. And to be clear, this presentation is about popular music. Like other forms of communal music that became popular, thinking about jazz or Western or country music, mariachi germinated as a result and alongside the development of technological media, making evident the transformation of folk form into popular culture, and more importantly, into an iconic national symbol of cultural Mexicanness. It is along this transformation that the topic of mariachi rears much debate and contention. Mariachi, however, has an interesting history with academic research. For much time, mariachi presented too folk, or too popular, or too commercial to be considered seriously by musicologists. And then on the opposite end, it's not folk enough to be interested, to find interest in ethnomusicologists and folklorists. Most any time I mention to someone that my research is based in studying mariachi, people have some type of personal experience to share. If, for instance, did you know that the word mariachi comes from the French word mariage? If Linda Ronstadt hadn't recorded Canciones de mi Padre, mariachi musicians would not be working today as much. We went to this Mexican restaurant and there were only 4 musicians, but they were still very loud. Okay? The comprehension of mariachi has been much more guided by the popular imagination rather than invested research to understand this cultural expression. And not until the 1970s, late 70s and 1980s, did researchers begin to think about mariachi in deeper ways. So in this presentation, I focus on the material archive of mariachi music, which transpired from the film and audio industry. The canción ranchera, the son and huapango mariachero, and the bolero ranchero were popular music in the 1940s and 1950s. And it is at this time that mariachi music transformed from centrally working as a communal dance form to a performative presentation to which people listened. The transformation constituted new manners of performance and protocol as mariachi shifted also into a wage labor format structured within the frames of capital. Various researchers characterize the contemporary modern mariachi in this manner, and I agree with that. The contemporary mariachi is undoubtedly commodified in market-driven music. From the working musician perspective, however, I need to bring up that mariachi fomented an archive of repertory of songs, methods, practices, and a nurturing memory that served as an alternative repository of information about popular and expressive culture that connects directly to the socio-political aspects and conditions characterizing the Mexican community throughout Greater Mexico. Meaning they still serve the communities in which they live. It is no accident that the mariachi music, especially in the United States, is one of the few music forms that is fully sponsored by their community. Meaning, for instance, in San Jose, there's like 25 mariachis. There's another 12 bandas. There's probably like 12 conjuntos norteños and a handful of trios. And all those musicians work every weekend. And it's not in clubs, it's not in restaurants, it's being hired for birthday parties, or for weddings, for quinceañeras, for funerals. And so I try to identify another community that does that. Thus, distinguishing that mariachi musicians demonstrate a pliability in working in diverse contexts of music making. I argue that the canonical repertory of mariachi was composed from a cosmopolitan perspective created specifically for the market. So I will focus on the role and impact of composers who were not familiar with mariachi, yet contributed to the soundtrack of Mexican national identity, Mexicanidad, utilizing the mariachi ensemble as their oral conduit. My argument extends to illuminate that the mariachi practitioners nonetheless developed pedagogies and methodologies for their musical practices that did not integrate in the circulations of media, but were grounded within the local scenes of performative work. Concurrently, as mariachi ensembles migrated to Mexico City from rural towns of Jalisco and confronted the conditions and structures of modernity at the turn of the century, the sonic aspirations and appropriations of cosmopolitan composers such as Manuel L. Ponce, Blas Galindo, Jose Pablo Moncayo, Jerónimo Vaquero Foster, and of course, Carlos Chavez, forged a pathway for vernacular music of Mexico to have a place in the national imagination. These Western art music composers created the works to be evaluated, re-envisioned, commissioned, and presented in the venues pertaining to Western art world, the Western art world. But there was other students of Western art music such as Ignacio Fernandez Esperón and his cousin, Manuel Esperón, who found their calling in the technological media sweeping the nation, recognizing that film in particular was to provide a new venue for composers, envisioning a career to musicalizar film. It's doubtful that they initially envisioned the mariachi to be part of their film orality, nor that they were to contribute to an extensive archive of the canción ranchera. Nonetheless, it was with the success of the iconic film Allá en el Rancho Grande, produced in 1936, starring Tito Guizar, that the canción ranchera came to rise to a national level. And I should mention that it was Lorenzo Barcelata who was the musical director of that movie. I think it's really important to also, this Allá en el Rancho Grande always gets kind of the top billing for being the moment. But we also have to identify there was another film called Cielito Lindo, in which had this two scenes with Lucha Reyes singing canciones ranchera. And as we can imagine, because of kind of this normative of masculinity, of course, Tito Visa becomes the big star. And Lucha Reyes was not even credited in the film in Cielito Lindo. These early films often utilized guitar ensembles rather than mariachi groups to accompany the singers. But the mariachi proved to be an ideal accompaniment for this music. So as the film industry took hold, different Mexican folk music ensembles were integrated into the soundscapes of these emerging films. But no musical style amalgamated to the extent of the mariachi. As a result, the mariachi was catapulted into the limelight and a whirlwind of transformation, establishing national recognition and gaining celebrity status. But at the same time, the concept and identity of mariachi concomitantly endured a stereotyping in which the word itself indexed a position of lower status as well as derogatory meaning. These stereotypes transpired from how the musicians were represented in the films, but were also tethered much more to the social hierarchies already established from the colonial past that continues to reverberate through what Aníbal Quijano refers to as the coloniality of power. The movies themselves became a tool in which many hegemonic and hierarchical orders continue to be reinforced in terms of gender, class, sexuality, and race, and specifically, thinking about indigeneity in Mexico. The working class musicians from the rural areas of Jalisco dealt with this hegemonic stratification as they were, as entertainers presented into the circles of artists, actors, politicians, and cosmopolitans. What becomes disregarded in this tumultuous change is the reality of the mariachi musicians themselves, how they lived, how they existed, how they were received, and their contributions to the repertoire and the praxis which constituted through their experiences and performances. As a new developing field of labor, mariachi musicians, along with most people from the rural areas that migrated to the urban centers, mandatorily rehearsed new protocols defining their roles in the different contexts in which they would perform, whether it be at a wedding, social gatherings of the community, or the new settings of a recording studio, a movie set, a campaign trail of an up-and-coming politician. New age practices were developed, as well as new expectations of behavior, hygiene, and dress. Equally significant is the new performances practices that fostered a central epistemology tailored to the musician's ways of being in the different contexts. So in the following, I'm gonna provide more of a theoretical framework. So I hope you all can keep up. Stay with me, and we'll get to some good, nice, some really exciting film examples. So tracking a series of recordings and videos, I want to focus on these videos and recordings that have solidified a canonical repertoire, and to illuminate the rise of genres and of artists, to demonstrate the mariachi's interaction with popular musical trends, and to identify distinctive compositions that demonstrate different types of consciousness that can be identified as social and potentially political. In the presentation, I consider the music of mariachi as popular music. And in agreement with George Lipsitz, I view popular music not as history, but as a text that can be read historically, dialogically, and symptomatically to produce valuable evidence about change over time. Popular music that can mark the present as history, helping us understand where we have been and where we are going. I frame mariachi music in this conversation as popular, but it is important to keep in mind the conversations around folk music and practices, to which I turn to Robin Kelly, who reminds us that terms like folk, authentic, and traditional are socially constructed categories that have something to do with the reproduction of race, class, gender hierarchies, and the policing of the boundaries of modernism. He continues that folk and modern are both mutually dependent concepts embedded in unstable, historically and socially constituted systems of classification. In other words, folk has no meaning without modern. Unless we deconstruct the terms folk and authentic and see modern and traditional as mutually constitutive and constituting, we will miss the dynamic process by which culture is created, as well as the relationship to constantly shifting experiences, changes in technology, and commodification. The integration of mariachi into the technological developments of media, no doubt, was going to shift and transform the music in practice. While things unfortunately will be lost, the songs, the instruments, the styles, methods of playing, attention must be given to what has been sustained and what was gained. And today we are fortunate to be able to watch the classic movies, listen to the recordings from the turn of the last century, and have access to an abundance of resources at a touch of a button, all of which can be analyzed to determine the evolution of mariachi music and the practice through time and space. In producing analysis, however, we have to be aware of the dynamic of power and access, as Kelly suggests. Even for a music form like mariachi that has been highly mass-produced, diffused, and commodified, it is important to identify on whose terms was this music authorized. More importantly, to what extent did the commodification of the music determine how the mariachi musicians engaged the practice, as well as how did they engage their audiences and the so-called consumer. While mariachi attained its symbolic value through the media between the 1930s and 60s, and as evident has lost a lot of value as a popular product for consumption, the cultural world of mariachi that exists at the local level continues to be vibrant as community members consume, contract, pay, and celebrate the mariachi who fulfill the requests of families at the weddings, birthday parties, and funerals. Philip Berry, in his study of folk music in 1914, was already identifying the influence on literacy, or written music, on oral traditions, and suggested early on, as broadside publications provided new disseminations of folk songs, that we pay attention to the singer, to the performer of the folk songs, as alternative media of transmission. Berry is identifying the singer as the carrier of repertoire, as of knowledge and of tradition. Yet, as someone that can also interrupt the tradition by making the folk song their own, especially in the context of performance. Berry, along with Diane Taylor, whose wonderful work, The Archive and the Repertory, helped clarify that performance in itself is disruptive and opens up a world of danger and potential. Performance in its disruptive capacity meaningfully reminds us that in this moment in which there are school curriculums, educational conferences, and workshops that depend on written materials as a means of transmission, the mariachi is still very much an oral tradition. It also gives credence to the many mentors, friends, and colleagues who in the many performances, in bars and weddings and concerts and funerals, continuously share knowledge on how to sing, on how to play, and how to act. Importantly, teaching me how to embody the politics of performance. As Taylor states, embodied performances have always played a central role in conserving memory and consolidating identities in literate, semi-literate, and digital societies, and understanding that not everyone comes to culture and modernity through writing. A performance establishes both a conscious and physical embodiment of action that coordinates a thought process and a movement that will be embedded into one's memory, and is, if successful, in producing results that are desired. And if not successful, then you know you can disregard it or learn from it. My interest in performance is grounded in the idea that the songs, videos, and recordings are resources for analysis that work to establish points of departure and that can be easily interrupted. These resources also establish a pedagogical past that proposes common sense, nostalgic romanticism, and cultural inequities and hierarchies solidified through the hegemonic hierarchies resonating from a colonial past. So in this sense, I find solace in the work of Anita Kumar, whose accounts of Bharatanatyam dance that led her to discuss Homi Bhabha's idea of the double narrative. She states, the pedagogical representation of the nation state treats people as a timeless and essential object. Simultaneously, the nation is conceptualized as a reiterative process of signification, constantly in flux as it is enacted in the present, which is the formative. This double narrative is what Bhabha refers to as the splitting of the national subject, characterized by perpetual movement between a time of the past, which is the pedagogical, and the present, the performative. It is in this state of liminality that Bhabha claims as the narrative space of the contemporary nation state. As an iconic symbol of the nation, mariachi merits deep analysis of the textual documentation to make evident whose voices are being elevated in these materials, which have contributed substantially to the representation of Mexicanidad, or Mexican identity in general. The juxtaposition of performance not only reifies the maintenance of practice, but more importantly, resignifies new meanings and discourses that demonstrate the transformation through time and space, but also the value and vibrancy of cultural expressions, as Philip Wallman has proposed in his work. So I'm going to move on to some of the musical analysis, and I'm going to start with a video of the movie the movie Canta, which featured Mariachi Marmolejo, this Cirilo Marmolejo. And this is the first sound film that was produced in 1932 in Mexico. And this scene includes the mariachi in a very natural context in which they're playing at a feria, like a public town fair. And it introduces both a slight image and sound of the mariachi on their own terms. So this music, again, this is dance music. And the genre of music most bound to the mariachi is the son, a matrix of song, poetry, and dance performed in convivial celebrations. The majority of the son repertoire is based on unknown composers which have collectively composed, but agreeing with Barry, at some point somebody had to write a melody, write a verse, and kind of arrange the song, whether it came from another place or not, if it was native to the region. And this was also, then it's brought into the communal process, which Barry referred to as the communal recreation. And it's through this performance, this process upon which others contribute to the development of the son. Generally speaking, sones are structured by an introduction, a verse, a chorus, and 8-part instrumental interludes that do not really create a storyline, but rather eliminate imagery. The journalist Hector Davalos suggested, the verses are simple and the rhymes are occasionally forced, but they are almost always ingenious, picturesque, and quite graphic, as are the ranchers of the region, with their marvelous sense of humor and partiality to easily understood figures of speech. Ernst Raphael continues this thought to include that they are traces of irony and fantasy in these metaphors. And we think of one verse, ausente de mí estarás, pero no de mi memoria, me cabe la vanagloria que ausente te quiero más. You'll be absent from me, but not from my memory. And my pride fits well that being absent, I love you more. So, I'm gonna continue with another clip. This one's called Así es mi, this is from the movie Así es mi tierra. This one features Mariachi Vargas, a very young version of Mariachi Vargas. And it's actually, the group was credited as Mariachi Silvestre Vargas.
A veces de que está buena me devuelve la ilusión y me pierde el miedo de perder esta ocasión. Pero es que yo ya no puedo con la cruz de esta pasión. Pajarito enamorado, ¿cómo le hacen para cantar? Cuando estás atormentado por las ansias de llorar. Ayer lloró una mañana porque no la pude leer. Ya va desde una semana y hasta cuándo podrá ser. Y me pide impaciente mi cobarde está el dolor. Hoy con toda la gente se lo pudo por mi amor. Pajarito satisfecho, ¿cómo le haces para cantar? Cuando sabes que en su aprecio tu cariño no ha de entrar. Aunque quiera despedirme, no me puedo despedir. De acabo ya tengo 15 y usted no me quiere oír. Pajarito apasionado, como le antes va a cantar. Y te alejas de su lado, no queriéndote alejar. Tanto nomás, tú lo verás, cuando lo veas no lo verás. Mira nomás, date para atrás con todo y todo. ¡La quiero más!
What is obvious in this is that the mariachi has already transformed from the previous group wearing a peasant clothing to wearing the traje de charro or the traje de gala, an elegant and highly adorned suit that the horsemen wear when going out, not necessarily when they're working. The ensemble is joined by Pepe Gutierrez, a singer that worked with mariachi artists during the 30s in this version of Ignacio Esperón composition, El Pajarito. Now, Ignacio Fernández Esperón, also known as Tata Nacho, studied composition with the French composer Edgar Varese in New York City, where he was also roommate with George Gershwin. He continued his studies in Europe and at the Paris Conservatory and at the Escuela Canta. Upon returning to Mexico, he directed the Orquesta Típica de la Ciudad de Mexico, an institutional ensemble that set precedent for communal orchestras throughout the nation. Apparently, he scored only a few films. However, he contributed a variety of compositions to the different types of popular ensembles and directed the radio program Así es mi tierra for the station XEW, La Voz de las Américas. In 1937, he scored the music for this film, Así es mi tierra, that starred Mario Moreno, Cantinflas. This was his second film, and utilized the mariachi barrios throughout. And it is believed that Tata Nacho actually taught them the songs by rote, which they recorded and performed in the movie. Now, Manuel Esperón, who is the cousin of Tata Nacho, would grow to be the most prolific composer of mariachi music, setting the standard for the canon. He was born in Mexico City and studied at the Superior School of Music of the National Institute of Fine Arts. He was enamored with the role of the piano accompaniment for silent film, to the point where he became a piano accompanist to silent films. He scored his first film, La Mujer del Puerto, in 1934, and would go on to musicalize close to 750 films. In 1941, he scored 20 films that were released, illuminating how he was sought after during this era of the golden era of film. He also worked extensively in radio and later in TV programs as the musical director and composer. Esperón's initial films with mariachi that began in 1941 differed from his cousin, Tata Nacho's approach. Esperón had the mariachi pre-record staples of their repertory and utilized them as like public scenes or a dance scene. And so it'd be the mariachi, the songs that they would play. However, for the central big composition, big spectacular pieces that Esperón composed, he would actually use an orchestra. This is one of his most famous songs, and this is Jorge Negrete, who did not want to sing and be in this movie.
Ay, Jalisco, 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 tú tienes tu novia que es Guadalajara. Muchacha bonita, la perla más rara de todo Jalisco es mi Guadalajara. Me gusta escuchar los mariachis cantar con el alma sus lindas canciones. Oír cómo suenan esos guitarrones y echarme un tequila con los valentones. Ay, Jalisco, no te
on. I want to show this one. I'm going to start it.
De barbecho, con tajadas de machetes y vibrar de guitarra. Lo aprendí por el palenque, apostando un gallo vino, y me siento suficiente para cantarlo por aquí. Al orgullo de Jalisco lo nombraron mi padrino, y no tiene más ahijados porque ya me quiere a mí. Sangre brava y colorada, retadora como filo de puñal, es la sangre de mi raza, soñadora y cancionera, sangre brava y peleonera, valentona y pendenciera como penca de nopal. A las patas de un caballo juego siempre mi dinero, y si algunas veces fallo me desquito en un albur. Digo siempre a flor de boca la tonada que más quiero, para ver a quién le toca y para echarle a su salud.
So we see that it'll take a couple of years for Esperón to actually integrate the mariachi into the orchestration. In this song, we can actually hear the vihuela and the guitarrón participating in the orchestration, but it's still dominated by this large orchestral sound that's not necessarily the mariachi. But interestingly, in an interview produced by UNAM, Esperón is kind of talking about his experience working with mariachi. And he states that one of my successful triumphs in my life was to bring together the mariachi with the symphonic orchestra. And they got along, and they played together, and it was beautiful. And that's how it was, nothing more. How I did this to this day, I don't know exactly. He continues, it's a triumph that I have cherished, and then pounding his head to teach the mariachi how to read. And this, in this performative statement, emphasized by a physical hand pounding of taking credit for the education of the mariachi musicians, again reverberates this paternalistic hierarchy of colonial times, reinstating the goals of the clerics who taught indigenous people the songs of the masses, of the mass and the musical ways of Europe, reifying certain hierarchical logics of high and low culture. Esperón contributed to producing a context that both created a fountain of work for the mariachi musicians that learned how to read and were technically able to play more complicated pieces of music from that which they already established in the mariachi repertoire. It encouraged mariachi musicians to study music in a classical system. This mandate of formal training also pushed musicians out of the ensembles that continued to work in the film industry. It is also important to understand Esperón taught the musicians songs by rote, but most likely did not provide music lessons to them. And Miguel Martinez, in his biography, confirms that he received method books from the composers, but he had to go out and find a teacher to teach him how to kind of work through those method books. Nonetheless, the contributions by Esperón transformed the mariachi ensemble musically. The song genre of the canción ranchera, which was not defined by a specific musical form, meter, tempo, or format, but rather characterized by the typical themes of amor, desamor, regional patriotism, that incorporated nostalgic imagery of the rural and establishing gender roles from the male perspective. And this is obviously performed throughout these movies. This was also, I think we also have to identify that this was much more based in the work of the lyricists, such as Ernesto Cortázar, a musician who worked early on with Lorenzo Barcelata, another musical director that I mentioned earlier in the group Los Trovadores Tamalipecos. Cortázar also worked as a screenwriter, establishing storylines for many of the movies that Esperón scored. So he was writing the lyrics for these songs so they can go along with the storyline. Together, Cortázar and Esperón came up with incredible hits like Copula, No Volveré, Arandas, and many more. The epic orchestral arrangements incorporated, however, in these movies, incorporated female voices. They incorporated guitar trios, mariachi ensembles, and full orchestras. And it's also, here we see Maria Elena Vasquez, who has an incredibly beautiful voice. But would never become the household name of who Jorge Negrete would be. Besides Maria Felix and Rosa Quintana, we don't have that lingering memory of all these women that sang, duets with Pedro Infante, with Miguel Aceves Mejia, and so it just kind of illuminating the dynamic and the hegemony that was in place. One of the other things about Esperón too, I think we do want to give him credit for this really creativity, because he would also kind of develop a way to intersect genre styles. So a song like Copula and Tequila con Limón have this these wonderful orchestrations, but it starts off in these 2/4 meters or as a polka, but he'll integrate into a son and kind of demonstrate an incredibly dynamic flow of musical and melodic thought. And so again, songs like Copula, Aunque no quieran o no, and Tequila con Limón are some of these spectacular pieces that he wrote. I want to move on to Rubén Fuentes and the Mariachi Vargas de Tecalitlan. And Rubén, at the age of 18 in 1944, was invited by Silvestre Vargas to join Mariachi Vargas. Fuentes, as he stated, I arrived to mariachi, and in my life had not heard this before, not even the song Ay Jalisco no te rajes. I did not know anything of mariachi music. But it was this man who would be one of the pioneers of the mariachi, modern mariachi. The statement above was taken from an interview with Rubén Fuentes and conducted by TV reporter Ricardo Rocha. This is the photo of the interview, which took place in the home of Fuentes, where he sits behind the grand piano that is placed in a corner of a room in which the walls are adorned with a variety of classical art pieces. The image of the interview, along with a discussion, indexed a cosmopolitan poetics. In discussing the mariachi, the sentiment centralized Fuentes' goals and demands of the musicians. Yet, at no point does he acknowledge any value of the mariachi as he discovered it, a rural communal expression finding its place in the urban metropolis of Mexico City. In a different interview, Fuentes explains that the first time he heard mariachi, he says, it was a very primitive group who played by ear, as they say. Rocha, in his interview with Fuentes, states, and ultimately asks, the members of Vargas did not play music. You had to, little by little, convince them to decide to learn. And I want to ask you this. Were you ever afraid of taking away the essence of the mariachi? Because I suppose that doing something as difficult as musically enriching them implied a risk that someone would say, hey, that's not how mariachi is. You know, I had hoped that Rocha himself, very much cosmopolitan, made a blunder in stating the musicians did not play music. More disappointing is that Fuentes did not correct the interview. The language utilized in this discussion and interview in general juxtaposed a public imagination of the music of mariachi, positioning it as a less valuable form. That enriching mariachi musically was a burdensome, unimaginable task. Fuentes does respond to the question, well, I think there was a moment when several people thought or suggested that I was destroying it. He further explains, I never thought I was really changing it. Rather, I thought I was medio arreglando, half arranging it. Other comments in the interview demonstrated his insensitivity to the class difference between himself and the musicians of Mariachi Vargas. He commented on their hygiene and their styles of clothes, not taking into account their socioeconomic conditions. The interview continues and Rocha asks, how was it that this young kid, this chamaquillo, was going to come in and teach those of Mariachi Vargas with an attitude of not being that friendly, referring to the comments of hygiene and dress. Half jokingly, Fuentes responds, well, I had the opportunity to be able to run almost everyone out of the group. Within 2 years, everyone was new, except for Silvestre, his father, and Miguel Martinez. The latitude that Silvestre Vargas provided to Fuentes established a hierarchy that anything musical was ultimately going to be decided by this new young person, and who within 10 years transformed the sound into what people describe as the mariachi, the modern mariachi sound. Fuentes' authority lasted from 1944 until he passed in February 5th, 2022. And I'll give you an example of the transformation of sound. one of the beautiful things about that first recording of Gavilancillo from 1947, there's actually a dancer in that, zapateando, you know? And nobody would even consider doing something like that, or at least 10 years later. I mean, the idea was trying to perfect the sound of the music and create a final product of perfection. But to me, the inclusion of the zapateado and the inclusion of Silvestre Vargas is kind of milestone gritos, kind of this is kind of the first these are the first recordings where people are integrating that sentiment of what that conviviality was. Here's the recording 10 years after Fuentes.
A ver si puedo agarrar a una pollita en el nido. A ver si puedo agarrar a una pollita en el nido. Ay, mira la la la, ay la la la, ay mira la la la, ay la la la. Yo soy un gavilancillo que ando por aquí perdido. A ver si puedo agarrar a una pollita en el nido.
Now Rubén Fuentes becomes the arranger for the mariachi sound. People want to identify it as modern. To me, the moment of modernity is when the first mariachi, the Cuarteto Componen, left their town and went to Mexico City, and had become and were recorded and were paid and contracted to play. So we have already kind of like 30 years of modernity being processed into the mariachi. But a lot of people identify Fuentes as creating the mariachi modern sound. And what he definitely did was standardize the orchestration or the ensemble itself. He would go on to create a wonderful genre of music called the bolero ranchero that led up to a large body of work that was performed by singers like Javier Solis. And one of Fuentes' most successful composition in the genre with the lyrics by Alberto Vázquez was Cien Años, which Fuentes integrates an electric guitar and a Hawaiian slack guitar. And so this idea of medio arreglando keeps extending itself. And it's wonderful. I know I might sound like I'm dancing with Fuentes. I'm a huge fan, and the music he created is amazing. But we also have to give credit to those mariachi musicians that learned how to play it and created the real sound and made it work.
Pasaste a mi lado con gran indiferencia, tus ojos ni siquiera voltearon hacia mí. Te vi sin que me vieras, te hablé sin que me oyeras, y toda mi amargura se ahogó dentro de mí. Me duele hasta la vida saber.
Sorry, I'm gonna move on really quick. I also wanna just talk about a little bit, in around 1957, he was contracted by RCA to write a series of songs for Miguel Aceves Mejia, and he utilized the son huasteco as an influence to kind of create this huapango for mariachi arrangements. And in this, but when he got this contract in 1957, RCA said, just do whatever you want. And this is where he kind of, again, goes farther beyond and extends the orchestration to be integrated, but it's not like Esperón, where Esperón integrated the mariachi on the terms of the orchestra. Fuentes he integrates orchestral instruments on the terms of the mariachi. And we still have a very distinct mariachi sound that's augmented by other instruments. They hear flutes, trombones, a flugelhorn, not flugelhorn, a French horn, cello, violas.
Ay, de aquel que a las mujeres les da el amor y el dinero, cuando menos se lo piensa se queda en el puro cuero. Por eso yo vivo errante sin confiar en la mujer. Cariñitos de un instante y no volverlos a ver.
Por eso yo vivo errante sin confiar en la mujer. Cariñitos de un instante y no volverlos a ver.
So as you can hear, there's no loss of the mariachi sound, and actually even forefronts the rhythm section. So we get the vihuela, the guitarrón front and center, which is, kind of one of the foundational elements of the sound itself. So, I started this discussion, and I think one of the goals of this presentation was to was based on my bias to uplift the mariachi and demonstrate the foundational songs that illuminate integrity, political consciousness, social awareness, that brings dignity to the cultural expression. As the architects of the Canción Ranchera, they were not thinking about those things, but rather invested in creating a nostalgia characterized by a cosmopolitan imagination of the world. But nonetheless, there's always something that stands out, and providing a glimmer of hope, and that disrupts this standardization. And there was a song that came out in 1934 when Lázaro Cárdenas was running for office, and it's just unknown who actually composed it, but it's undoubtedly was a mariachi musician. This is Las Algaristas. I'm gonna move on. The last verse of it, though, it says, "Cuando estés en el poder, en nombre de tu bondad, te acuerdas del mariachi cuando te vino a cantar." And it was believed, and as a result, there was Lázaro Cárdenas actually created a position for a mariachi ensemble to be an official ensemble that represented the police department, and they were put on a salary. And it was Cirilo Marmolejo was the first group to attain that position, and later on Mariachi Vargas went into that position, and today that still exists. Now, a dear friend of mine just got hired. He had to apply for the position and got hired. Y'all know Antonio Covarrubias? Yeah. Yeah, he's in that group right now.
All right.
Yeah. Anyways, so the canción ranchera, the bolero ranchero, the huapango, in addition to these sones, jarabes, polkas, fomented a foundational repertory for the mariachi, and composers such as Fuentes and Esperón, many others, and the gift of Juan Gabriel continue to fill the repository of the songs that the mariachis would play. Songs from the movies, radios, recordings, as pedagogical documents that establish the expectations of what mariachis will play in the performative present. However, in the communal space of performance, which differed from the rehearsed spaces of recordings, film, and concerts, required acts of improvisation, of rearrangement, of reconstruction, and composition, what I'll refer to as recomponiendo. When mariachi ensembles began fulfilling the request to perform the big epic pieces of Esperón and Fuentes, immediately they had to learn the songs, many by ear, and recomponerlo, reconstitute it to accommodate the capacity and the instrumentation of the ensemble. Mind you, they didn't have the trombones, they didn't have the flutes, they probably had less violins, but they had to make this song performable. So the skills of improvisation and recomponiendo also tied directly to the abilities of accompaniment to engage and lift the gathering in which they perform. And as a musician, I was working in San Jose at a restaurant, and I was working with a wonderful group that had all these kind of skills to just create a song on the spot, whether we knew it or not. But there's these moments when we would play for the owner of the restaurant, who was from Michoacan, and the singer, the main singer of the group, who was the director, Juan Francisco Diaz, who was also referred to as El Pato, would sing El Hijo del Pueblo. And there's this one line that says, Descendiente de Cuauhtémoc, Mexicano por fortuna. And he would always just sing for the owner, Descendiente de Cuauhtémoc, Michoacano por fortuna. And the crowd, half of them were Michoacanos, and they, it just blows up. But the owner of the restaurant also sang, and we would accompany him. And we would follow him, he would start in one pitch and shift to another pitch, and we follow him, But he also would sing, El Hijo del Pueblo, and he would sing that same line as Pato. But then there's another line at the end where it says, yo compongo mis canciones pa que el pueblo me las canta. And he would always say, yo compongo mis canciones pa que el pato me las canta, And so there's this wonderful kind of ability to have this dialogic kind of interaction. And it comes out of the ability of these musicians to be incredibly charismatic and paying attention to who's who in the audience, and knowing who the audience is and kind of taking into account how do you lift up that space. The skills of improvisation, the story of Pato and Genaro is an interesting in their manipulation of the lyrics of Jose Alfredo, but more importantly, they illuminate the dialect of which El Hijo del Pueblo becomes a conduit for them to honor each other. And remembering Barry's proposal to pay attention to the singer resonates strongly in mariachis, because the focal point of the ensemble is who we call the cancionero, the person who knows all the words to all the songs. There is a manner of work referred to as talón, hustling or kind of playing piecework, in which a client pays musicians on an established fee per song. The cancionero plays a central role in whether the mariachi works or not. The aspect of recomponiendo then also plays a really important role in those situations when the cancionero is the only person that knows the song. In this situation, being able to fulfill a request is an utter performance. So the cancionero will basically just sing the melody to the trumpet players and the violins, and the rhythm section will figure out how to follow it. And it's in that moment, that, we talked about this yesterday with Johnny and Ruben, is this idea of having this repository of licks or adornos or pieces of music that can be utilized in any of these songs, and how to be able to kind of pull from that, and having leadership in the different sections to say, the violins, da-da-da-da-da, just like that, and they find their first and second, third part. And that's that ability of kind of recomponer in the moment. So when Esperón suggests that, his most cherished triumph is that he taught mariachis to learn how to read music, Miguel Martinez in his biography does state that learning music literacy was a gratifying achievement, which opened up opportunities for him to become an arranger, a composer, and musical director for mariachi and other types of ensembles. It is, however, important to ask what constitutes triumph for the lírico, the person that learns by ear, does not read music, but nonetheless, who attains a body of knowledge that is shared with so many in the immediate community. Rubén Fuentes, medio arreglando mariachi, has raised him into the pantheon of mariachi icons. And there's an actual Mariachi Hall of Fame in Albuquerque. Is there one here also in Tucson? There's one here too, right? And I'm sure Rubén Fuentes is part of that, right? Yeah. But will there be a day in which those who demonstrate profound skills of recomponiendo songs in the live performance, which merit award, tributes, and honor? And my proposal is, as we teach mariachi music in the educational systems of the United States, and depending on depending of the pedagogical past and that determine the expectation, we at least recognize the illuminating skills that's set within the ideas of recomponiendo as valuable as learning to read and write music. And I'll end there. Thank you very much. I did want to show, the reason I showed the Juan Gabriel piece is if you watch Juan Gabriel, nobody knows how he's going to sing at any time. He changes his own melodies. He changes his own meters. He changes his phrasing. And that Mariachi Arriba Juárez, led by all these amazing musicians from Mexico City, had to work with him nightly. They toured with him, and of course they got a sense of how he works, and they and become very much part of his performance. But it's the Juan Gabriel was to demonstrate what accompaniment means. Okay. So if anybody has any questions, I guess we can open it up to questions.
Okay. My one question is, how do you compare the history of I wouldn't really say like the commercialization of mariachi to like the history of commercialization of jazz.
Okay. The question is how would I kind of compare the commercialization of mariachi with the commercialization of jazz? We're going to find parallels because it's still based. Both of them are based on technological integration. The documentation of their music And with that comes standardization. Once you get a recording of a song, everybody's gonna learn that version of the song. So all these different variations that would occur before, thinking in Mexico, all the pueblitos would play the same song, but there would be something different about it. They'd have different instruments, and understanding that, the standardization of the ensemble wasn't a thing. It's like whoever played whatever instruments there would be part of the ensemble. So, and we saw there were Mariachi Marmolejo that had clarinet in it, and there's these wonderful photos of them with like a bass. It looks like like a trombone, but I think it's like more of a baritone, and then flutes and clarinets. But once we start hearing recordings, people start leaning towards emulating that recording. So you start seeing the ensembles formulating the same type of ensemble of a guitarrón, a vihuela, a guitar, trumpet, and a set of violins. And then the singing style too. So in jazz, we kind of see the same thing, where you see the early photos of jazz and you see a lot of banjo and violin and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden the orchestration, that gets recorded and either by big bands, they start establishing the standard ensemble. A 5-piece saxophone section, 4-piece trombone, and 4 trumpets, and rhythm section. So also, I think the idea of refining is always integrated, especially once you start documenting.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I hope this isn't too esoteric of a question, but we saw kind of how the instrumentation changed when mariachi went from rural to urban. And I'm wondering, that voice is also a part of instrumentation. Do we know about the origins of the gritos, and did those change over time? If we do know about that?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I think that it was Deb Vargas wanted to write on the grito. Deb Vargas is this wonderful scholar who writes on music and women singers, the notion of dissonance and kind of these contentions of the music making spaces. And she wanted to write about the idea of the grito, and we were trying to find something. There's not much. However, it's if you go to the pueblos, and they still have these danza, these dances, and they'll have banda. And people, the emotional energy that it emerges, and it emerges as gritos, and when people are watching a rodeo, people, I think we could think about a football game too, or a baseball game, or how's Arizona doing, by the way?
I think they're down.
24-21, we're losing.
And so these emotional, kind of explosions that occur. But when Silvestre Vargas had this incredible idea to record the grito, it shifted. Or rather, it sustained this kind of groundedness in the world. This is a reality that they lived with. But then, at the same time, you have kids trying to learn how to do the grito, and people trying to explain to them, and it doesn't become this kind of natural, organic thing. And the grito isn't something you try to imitate. It's something that comes out of you, and it should be your own proprio, expression. And so, I just remember seeing a youth group in San Jose, and this little kid goes up to the mic and goes, ah! And he couldn't get it to come out, you know? And it was like this, and then the next kid just came out and said, "No te rajes, Jalisco," and that was just natural, and it just felt way better. And so the idea is, and it's not also just the scream; it's the dicho, it's the phrase, you know, saying these phrases, and Silvestre had, you know, a wonderful repertory that he shared with the world on these recordings. You know, and now everybody still emulates a lot of those same phrases.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about mariachis. You talked a little bit about the erasure of la mujer and the whole scene of mariachi early on. And I saw maybe some of your slides later on that you talked about the masculinity of the mariachi music. Can you talk about some of the history of when la mujer cantante and also the woman as composer on the mariachi scene came into being,
Yeah.
came on the scene?
So the mujer, or the women composers have been there. We have incredible Maria Greber, who's at the, you know, during the turn of into the 19th century, was writing an incredible amount of music that was being recorded, and I mean, her songs were also recorded and translated into English. Cuando vuelva a tu lado, no me niegues, what a difference a day makes, 24 little hours. And esta alma mía, sola tan sola. I mean, she has this incredible body of work, but which were more kind of this romantic, well-developed romantic song form, which the mariachis at that time when she was writing was not playing. But later on, you know, when Rubén starts introducing the bolero itself and integrating it into the mariachi, which the music union fought. They didn't want the mariachis playing boleros because it belonged to the orchestras and the trios.
It was Cuban.
And, pardon?
From Cuban.
Well, yeah, well, it becomes a Mexicanized
Right.
bolero. But the bolero that comes from Cuba, but the thing is, Maria Greber was already writing that form. But the mariachi doesn't get it until after Rubén Fuentes, you know, is kind of introduced the bolero form. Emma Valdemar Valderrama, who wrote Mucho Corazón, and there's another, I'm blanking. But so there are women composers that are already set in and kind of revered, but they don't get to the mariachi. A mariachi doesn't get to them until later. The women as singers were always there. You know, we saw it. You know, and Lucha Reyes was always there. You know, but it just, the system itself was not set up to lift them up. Why? I mean, it's just, again, it's still the same kind of heteronormative masculine kind of context which was driving the film industry and the music industry itself. And I really doubt that there was women executives at any place in the industry. You know, all the producers, all the musical directors, all the screenwriters, most often were men. Nonetheless, we finally start seeing and acknowledging, but again, like this, Maria Velázquez was an incredible singer. Rosa Quintana was in all these movies, and we could see them, you know, in the films, and we can identify them, you know, but they were not given the same kind of promotion. They were not going out on the same tours as Pedro Infante and Jorge Negrete. And it wasn't until later that we finally see, you know, Lola Beltran, Lucha Villa, Queta Jimenez, you know, and some of these other women. That doesn't happen until the 50s, and probably, you know, and that's the other thing is by that time the film industry is starting to dissipate, and so there's not those kind of big promotional movies that everybody's gonna see, you know. Negrete was in hundreds of films. Mariachi Vargas was in hundreds of films. You know, Pedro Infante, Miguel Aceves, Luis Aguilar, you know, were all in you know, tons of films. But by the time they started identifying the women, there weren't that many films. Or they were really bad films. You know, I remember Lucha Villa filming in San Jose. They were doing a bunch of like films in California because the budget worked better that way. But so that's I think what we do need to identify is how those women broke down barriers to get on the tours, how they did survive on those tours and created space for themselves, and were eventually promoted.
It was hard.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. But they also paved the way for, you know, now I think there's more identifiable women singers than males performers, singers. And then for as mariachi musicians itself, that the women musicians in Mexico were always kind of treated as a niche, you know. They were kind of seen as novelty and kind of put into places to perform as novelty. But they actually, the thing is, you know, as a lot of musician friends would tell me, you know, my sister knew how to play vihuela, or my sister knew how to play violin, but my father didn't let her go out and play, you know. So that was not uncommon, you know. Then there was also, you know, we see the kind of the emergence of women, and you know, some of the pioneer women came out of San Jose. That was Barbara Perez, Rebecca Gonzalez, and Laura's from Watsonville. But there was also always women playing. Carmen Cristina in the valley in Fresno, Fresno was playing early on, and then you find these random photos, and there's a woman there singing, but nobody knows who they are. You know.
Very, very similar to what happened in literature in Mexican, even American and Mexican American literature. A lot of the same pattern.
No, well, this is, you know, unfortunately, a universe.
Yeah.
And so, can we thank Dr. Rodríguez?